Hello dear viewers, and welcome back to the ancient dwarven hold of our ancestors. Today I shall be discussing the game Skald against the Black Priory. Skald, as I shall now call it, is a computer role-playing game developed by High North Studios AS and published by Raw Fury. It was released on PC on the 30th of May 2024. Before we get going, dear viewers, if you like what I do down here in the ancient hold, then perhaps consider subscribing to the channel. Leaving a thumbs up will also be appreciated, and of course, if you fancy leaving a comment with your own thoughts on the game, then I would be most grateful indeed. It all means an awful lot to this old dwarf and my little channel. Skald is an old school computer role-playing game set in a dark world of cosmic horror, where you control a party of interesting characters in a quest to find a missing woman and perhaps discover the wickedness that is happening in the world around you. All of this, of course, is depicted in a retro 8-bit style that harkens back to the days of yesteryear. You'll participate in turn-based combat, level up your characters, learn new skills, talk your way out of precarious situations, and more. One of the machines that I grew up playing games on and such was the venerable Commodore 64. It had 64K of RAM and several colours. It had a tape deck and 10min flashy line loading screens. It was a glorious time for a child like me who'd never seen such things before. The games had that microcomputer vibe with low pixel counts and interesting colour combinations. The games never looked like they did on the holy arcade machines or the flashy box art, but it was simple, good fun, which I remember fondly. Skald is a throwback to those earlier times, kind of literally. The graphical style very much resembles that of which you might find on the C64 decades ago. The colours used are limited indeed, and the resolution is low. This is all on purpose, of course, as the developer was very much going for that retro feel. And it has come off very well in my humble opinion. If you aren't quite into this graphical style, or didn't grow up on this sort of thing, then I can imagine it could be quite a turn-off where you don't really want to play it. I can understand this, but if you do enjoy this sort of thing and or want to give it a go, then I think you're definitely in for a treat. There are no fancy 3D graphics or anything of the sort, which is by design of course. Instead, you're presented with some classic pixel art that stands up nicely on its own. The various screens that appear as you traipse through the world, interacting with various people and things of interest, you'll see all sorts of wonderfully crafted art that can be quite striking, especially considering the dark tone to the game. For this is a darker title meant for an older audience. Besides the art screens that are used for encounters and such, you have the overworld map, which facilitates the travel of your party through the world, from location to location, while there is the local map where you'll be moving about and doing things in most often. The overworld map is very fitting with the style going on here, looking dark and in keeping with the theme. The local area maps are similarly dark in tone and on message for what the game is trying to portray here. It obviously isn't meant to be some cutting-edge graphical output here, and I will stop going on about that as I've said it quite enough. The player characters, NPCs, and the numerous beasties that you'll encounter are drawn simply but have enough detail to give them a decent enough character that you can usually make out what they're supposed to be, perhaps your imagination filling in the rest. Player animations, when moving about the place and attacking with martial weapons, is fairly simple but meaningful. Your character will literally move up and down and left and right without any kind of fancy movements, and when standing still will do that thing that sprites used to do of moving up and down slightly as they are. Attacking can involve just a few frames of animation, but it conveys the action quite clearly. The sound of you crunching into something goes a long way in adding weight behind your actions. And with that, we better get into the sound of Skald. The soundscape of the game is, like its visual style, dark and thematic. The music resembles some of those old classic 8-bit tunes with a gloominess and dungeon synth feel to them. It is most wonderful, and I would happily listen to it just casually when not playing the game itself. Indeed, dear viewer, if you like this sort of thing, I would really recommend checking out the dungeon synth scene. There is some great stuff out there that not only reminds you of the old days with certain games, but also stands on its own as some just great music to listen to. Perhaps providing the backdrop while you play other games, read a book, paint some miniatures, or whatever else you might get up to. So, we have established I enjoy the music for this game. What of the rest, you say? Well, as I had mentioned earlier, the sounds of violence in combat are most impressive. When you strike a foe, with meaty thuds when downing a baddie or landing a critical hit that feels weighty and satisfying. Indeed, it is amazing what you can convey with simple graphics and capable sound engineering. There is a lot of dialogue in Skald, but alas, there isn't any voiceover going on here. By this point, I imagine you would have already assumed this. The old C64 games had no such thing, and as being a throwback to the old days, you having to read a lot of dialogue rather than hear it is certainly the intention. Besides this, there's a lot of text in the game, which I imagine would be quite costly to have voiced, and would increase the size of the installation dramatically. It's cool to read the dialogue yourself, imagining what the different characters might sound like. The artwork can do a lot to help you think about this. You begin Skald against the Black Priory on a ship set for the distant land of Idra, or Idra. You're a mercenary captain hired by a powerful baron to find his daughter, who you knew as a child. They have gone missing in a strange land and seemingly need some sort of rescuing. This isn't to say she is a helpless victim though, far from it. As you approach the island on a guild-chartered ship, there is a bit of a kerfuffle about getting close enough to allow docking and allow your men to disembark. The crew of the ship have heard stories about this place, and they fear something evil is in the water. They refuse to go any further and, just as it seems like there's going to be a rumble on the deck, you are indeed attacked by some tentacled monstrosity from the deeps. Your ship is wrecked and your company of mercenaries is seemingly lost. Will you survive and find some of your men and perhaps figure out what's going on? Much of the game will include you moving about either on the overworld map, between notable locations, and then the local map for any of said locations. Moving in either setting is represented on screen by a single sprite, and this sprite is of the character that you are currently having lead the party. This is important for anything you might encounter, both benign and malevolent, as it will be this character's stats that will be used to resolve anything. When moving around the overworld map, you will either be looking for new locations to explore or moving between them. You won't physically see monsters or anything else you could encounter, rather they just randomly pop up as you move about the place. This might be more likely to happen the longer you are on the overworld map, or it might just be totally random, I'm not sure. The encounters will usually take the form of some beasties to fight, but not always. When you have an event with some nasties, you'll usually be given several choices on how to resolve it. This can be attack, run away, try to stealth, or perhaps parlay. Remember, the stats used for anything will be whoever is leading the party. This is a tried and true mechanic when moving about on a game like this, but as it always has been, it can get annoying if you're pestered too often by roving bands of hellhounds or crabs with a grievance. Once you reach and enter a location, you'll be whisked off to the local map. From where you begin in the local area, you'll be able to explore and adventure as you might. Most encounters, like enemies or things to climb or lockpick or what have you, will be physically represented on the map, so you'll mostly know what you're getting yourself into. There are lots of locations from washed up beach fronts to cliffs, forests, witches' huts, castles and all sorts that you can get stuck into. There is good variation in surroundings. I do like that most maps are not overly large though and confusing, especially as there is no mini-map or otherwise to have a better understanding of where you are. You'll pick up quests from various people on your adventures, along with the main quest of course, which is the eventual concern. There are quests as you might imagine from a fantasy CRPG, like fending off some baddies, locating some doodad of sorts, or rescuing someone from evil's grasp. These pan out as you think they would, with you searching about for different quest items while seeing off some baddies that wish to do harm. There are little clues and things that you'll need to follow to get certain tasks done, like finding maps of tunnel systems or remembering the correct directions through a maze, but there is nothing too puzzly, which I like. With most encounters, being from coming across a lockbox to interacting with other characters, jumping over a pit or whatever else, you'll be making rolls against the stats of your party leader. The system used here is quite similar to D&D, with a difficulty requirement that you need to equal or best with a dice roll plus whatever skill is relevant. For example, when trying to get through a locked door, the difficulty might be 10. The game will roll 2d6 dice rather than a d20 and add the thievery stats to the total. If this equals or exceeds the difficulty, you'll have passed the check and opened the door. There are checks for different things, like trying to persuade someone using your diplomacy skill, or climbing up a cliff using athletics. I think the system works rather well, though it can be a bit of a bugger when you fail a roll that was almost certain to succeed, or conversely great adulation as you roll a double 6 you needed to get through. Inevitably, on your travels you'll be accosted by some nasty no-good evildoers and dangerous beasts that wish to do you harm. So you must make sure that you know how to defend yourselves. Combat in Skald is turn-based, using a square grid with all participants represented by their own sprite. Everyone involved will be able to take their turn, which is decided by initiative order. So the higher a character's initiative, the greater the chance they will have of going earlier in the fight. When it is a character's turn to activate, you'll be able to move them 3 squares and attack, or move 4 with no attack by default. You must use your movement first, then attack. If you move 1 square and attack, you can't then use the rest of your movement afterwards. Once you do swipe your sword or what have you, your turn is over. Characters can make any special attacks that they may have learned. Attacking and defending uses rolls, considering the hit characteristic as well as the dodge value of that being attacked. I'm not 100% sure on exactly how it works, but having a lot of plus hit will help you land a blow. The armour characters wear will also be able to soak a value that can allow characters equipped with heavier armour and shields and whatnot the ability to absorb some of the damage dealt to them. Besides the different attacks and skills you can use, there is spellcasting. There are all sorts of spells in the game, from heals to auras to fire and flames, summoning creatures and more. Spells are a bit weird, as they can often end your turn after casting one, but sometimes from some random roll I don't quite understand, you will cause the cascade effect, which allows you to continue their turn and attack again. As I say, I'm not totally sure how it works, but it is great when it happens, like with my paladin casting a heroic order and then being able to attack afterwards is really cool. If the cascade effect doesn't happen, then not using direct damage spells can feel like a bit of a bugger, a waste for your player's turn as they were unable to attack. I guess it is up to the dice gods to decide. I enjoyed the combat for what it is. It's not an overly complicated endeavour, with you moving your people around the screen and making their attacks or casting spells, allowing some good use of tactics, but it isn't going to knock your socks off. It is simple and it works. Sometimes I had trouble clicking the right character or mistakenly had someone move away from a baddie instead of attacking them, which is a bit of a pain. As I said, the grid used is square rather than hexagonal, which means the movement is limited and there are only 4 directions of an attack, rather than 6 as you cannot move or attack diagonally. I wonder perhaps if it would have been better with a hex grid, but I don't begrudge the game for going with a square one. With your party filling up with members, you'll need to build them up to fulfill various roles depending on your needs and, importantly, their class. You build your main character at the start of the game, deciding what class they'll be so you can set them up to be exactly as you want, from several choices. These involve the usual stuff like paladin, fighter, rogue, ranger and such, which is a decent enough variety. Each class has access to differing feats or talents, which they can spend some points on initially and further each time they level up, keeping on the theme. A paladin, for instance, has access to combat feats, increasing their skills with certain arms, but also holy spells that can buff your party or condemn your enemies. The ranger class has access to a lot of ranged attack feats, which make use of a bow, along with some nature-based spells. A fire mage has, access to a lot of fire. These feat points are powerful ways you can use to mould your heroes, so choose wisely. One thing which is a little bit of a pain is knowing whether certain feats stack, like blade damage and two-handed damage, or being able to backstab with a bow, which you can do, viewers, to great effect. Your hero will begin the game with a number of attribute points, of which you can add 2 from the start. These will have further effects on how well your character will perform with certain skills. Agility being good for a rogue, strength good for melee characters like a fighter or paladin, and so on. You must be extra wise and heed any tips about stats, as I've found no way to reset them in the game, and very rarely there are items that you can use to increase them, besides spells. There is also crafting in Skald, for both potions and food. Potions are good for all sorts of things, mainly in combat, while food is required for whenever you want to rest your party. For, like many CRPG games, your party will need a rest, lest they become exhausted, and also to regain their health, mana, and maybe a bit of inspiring by an entertainer. You will find ingredients for both food and potions on your travel. There is some discovery going on, trying different combinations at a crafting station or a fire or what have you, with a lot of the ingredients telling you what they are used in, which means you can throw several of them together in hopes of finding a recipe. I wonder if at some point in the early state of this game there were no hints, but feedback suggested that it was a bit harsh. I don't know. I think something that would have been nice with cooking specifically is different food types giving interesting buffs, depending on what you decide to consume. As it stands, you just need to eat enough food to cover the size of your party, with each item giving a numerical value that will add up to the total of your party, which is 10 per character. I think it would have been a bit more interesting and perhaps gave you some more impetus to go out and look for certain ingredients if they somehow buffed your characters. I would say that the overall narrative and general writing of Skald is very good. The developer has conjured up an intriguing tale that pulls you in. It feels like they've put great effort into building a deep world with detail and interesting lore. The characters on the whole feel three-dimensional and interesting to interact with. There are some very kooky and nutty characters in the world, along with some brave souls who try to stand firm against the tide of evilry. The writing had to be good in a game like this, and thankfully I feel that is indeed the case. The game doesn't require you to read everything that pops up with the extra details from mousing over certain words, but the information is there if you want it, which is nice. The overall gameplay of Skald against the Black Priory is solid. The loop of adventuring, fighting monsters, uncovering story threads, acquiring loot and levelling up is an enjoyable one. It flows quite nicely. I don't feel very stumped by anything, and even my old dwarven mind could figure some things out. Some of the environments are really well done, with you able to explore fantasy towns and forests and the like, which really helps to draw you into this fantastical world. I imagine it must have been quite fun creating all this. There are lots of little details and additions that make the game flow nicely as well. The developer might be going for a retro theme, but that hasn't come along with some additional issues as might be a concern. There is of course minimal loading going on, though I guess you could have simulated the 10-minute loading times, but perhaps that was best left out. You can save the game at almost any point with lots of space to do so. The menu system is sleek and functional, allowing you to navigate quickly to where you want to go. And I don't recall the game crashing or having any technical problems at all actually. The difficulty can also be adjusted at any time, should you find proceedings a bit too much. There are lots of things you can adjust besides the overall challenge, which is really nice. There is something to be said of the simple joy of running about some fantasy world and getting on with an adventure. Skald gave me that feeling quite often while I was playing. You do feel like you're involved with what's going on and wonder what the next scrape you will get into or large scary monster that you might have to take down with your fellow heroes. Achieving that state of mind isn't a particularly easy thing to do, but I do feel they've managed it here rather well. So, as you can tell, I really enjoyed playing this game. I too was initially unsure as to whether I would appreciate the graphical style that was going on here, as it had been so long, even with all the memories, but really once you play for a while you kind of forget all about that because the gameplay and story are well done. I think this is the key point and one worth remembering. Games do not need to be bleeding edge graphically with all the bells and whistles to entice you, no sir. There are games from my childhood that I still really enjoy, and I'm sure there are those from yours that you might like as well, even if they might look dated or old-fashioned. Realistically, the game is going to put some people off straight away. Some gamers need a certain level of graphical quality and perhaps don't care for something like this. That is totally fine and I completely understand, though I do perhaps lament the loss of the fun experience you might have had with this game. Skald against the Black Priory is mostly going to appeal to older dwarves like me, who've delved deep into the mountainside for long years and only encountered a small number of Balrogs. If you are around the age of myself and grew up with this sort of thing, then I think you are in for a cracking good time. But, dear viewer, if you are perhaps a bit younger or don't care for this 8-bit style stuff, then I would suggest that maybe give it a look anyway, especially if you are a fan of party-based RPGs. Skald has a very obvious rallying point in terms of appeal, and some people are simply not going to be interested. I think though that if you were to give it a go, you would enjoy it muchly. It is £13 currently on GOG and Steam, so you can't really go too wrong with it anyway. So perhaps it might be worth checking out, and even more so if it ever goes on sale. And there we go, dear viewers. Another video from me here down in the ancient dwarven hold of our ancestors. I guess this game might count for a Halloweeny sort of thing, with it being all dark and such, but it is also rather later than that day, so take it as you will. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I hope you're doing well. I shall see you next time.